welcome back to the channel. This is the Darklight Emissary, and today's video is going to go over what I consider the third member of the trinity of main Space Marine heroes in the Horus Heresy series and history, Nathaniel Garro, Battle Captain of the DeathGuard Legion. And while we are talking about Nathaniel last, he is certainly not the least of these three, and arguably is one of the most important, if not the most important, of the three individual Astartes we have talked about. If you are new on this channel, then there are previous videos about Captain Saul Tarvitz and Garviel Loken respectively, and I will try to link them here for you if you want to jump to those, either right now or before or after this video. And if you are new, I welcome you, and if you end up liking this content, I would love your subscription and your time on future videos, and past videos as well. There's quite a few videos out there already, and if you've already been here for a while, you know how much I appreciate you, and I appreciate your time here on these videos. Even if you are just here for the content and enjoy it, I personally appreciate it, and I appreciate the small but growing community we have here on this small corner of YouTube. But without further ado, we're going to jump straight into the history, the rise, and the fall and tragedy of Nathaniel Garro. Nathaniel, out of the three of the Astartes that we've talked about, I would say is probably the most humorless of the three. He's definitely one of the most stoic Marines of the era, and in general, I would say that I've remembered reading about. But like the other two, he is a man of uncompromising honor and integrity, and this is what saw him through for a very long time in the Horus Heresy conflict itself, and helped preserve him into the very ends of the conflict. And he was familiar with both Captain Tarvitz as well as Loken. All three of them could kind of see within each other that they were all honorable men, trying to do their best in the positions given to them, and they all carried themselves with a humble but strong, proud confidence in their abilities, and this was reflected in the honor and respect that their men showed back to their command as well. It seems like they were well liked and regarded by the men under their command for the most part. Nathaniel, we know a fair bit about his background. He was born on Terra in a colony called Albia there, and so he was one of the older Terran-born DeathGuard Marines, and he was with the DeathGuard before they were called that, when they were called the Dusk Raiders. And during that time period, the DeathGuard did not have the green trim and white armor they came to be known for, but they were a more dull marble color with a bright red right hand that was painted to symbolize them being the bloody right hand of the Emperor himself. And they took their namesake seriously. They would often assault at night when the sun would be first setting, hence their name. And Gero remembers fondly toppling many enemies of the Emperor with their older traditional tactics in this version of Legion before their Primarch was found. And as the Legion grew over time and turned into the DeathGuard after the finding of Mortarion and him turning the Legion into the DeathGuard, Gero kind of had concerns over the traditions changing from the Dusk Raiders over to the credo of the DeathGuard and the way that Mortarion changed the culture. While Gero was ultimately a professional and a great leader, he had concerns about changing over to DeathGuard traditions, and while he honored his Primarch's wishes, he still was concerned about the traditions that the Dusk Raiders had fading away completely, thinking that that kind of symbolized something dying in the Legion that was important. And all signs point to Gero both pining for the older days a bit and not being shy about his views on newer traditions. He seemed unafraid to speak his mind, which was a double-edged sword, especially as the Horus Heresy started boiling up over time here. He was invited to the Warrior Lodges, which was a main vector for how chaos infected the Traitor Legions. He didn't like their secretive nature, and he was just kind of able to discern that not all was well with these covens, and so he refused any invitation to join them. And Mortarion was not a Primarch that would often broker any amount of true, discourse or disagreement with his plans of action. He expected his sons to follow his commands resolutely and with exactness, but he did seem to respect Gero's positions on a lot of things. And strangely enough, this kind of led to why Nathaniel ended up being spared when it came to Isstvan III, where the traitor legions purged their legions of loyalist elements almost wholesale. Mortarion knew that Gero was very loyal to the Emperor and to the ideals of the Imperium, and he did not share his Primarch's negative sentiments regarding the Emperor in general, nor any, wanting to betray the Emperor or topple the Emperor like Mortarion ended up wanting to. Despite this difference in opinion, Mortarion kept Gero back from fighting on the surface of Isstvan III. He was held back purposefully, and for a time even served as Mortarion's equerry. So Mortarion thought highly of him, despite their differing of opinion. And when it came time to go down to Isstvan III, Gero wanted to go with the rest of his company, and he went to First Captain Typhon at the time, and basically demanded to be let to go down with his men down to the surface. He felt it was weird that he couldn't go, and that Mortarion had refused him to go down. And I still remember this scene very well, despite it being a while reading this book. Typhon basically, it said he narrowed his eyes a bit and basically just said, if it were up to me, Gero, I would let you go down there and, limp right on into battle. And at this time, I think Gero was injured from a previous conflict, so part of the excuse Mortarion used was, you're injured, you're not in any shape to go down there to begin with. Typhon had no such hesitation to send Gero down if he had wished, but he was not going to waylay an order from the Primarch himself. So this spared Gero from the same fate as his loyalist brothers on the surface of Isstvan III. Instead, Gero and 70 members of his company were aboard a frigate known as the Eisenstein, and he was essentially on security duty, just kind of watching the fleet's actions for them, as kind of one of the picket ships. And coincidence happened to shine upon him here, and he came across Saul Tarvitz trying to reach the surface in a commandeered fighter craft in a Thunderhawk, being pursued by Emperor's Children fighter craft trying to take him down. Gero and Saul Tarvitz were very close friends. They were basically considered honor brothers to each other. They had spent enough time together that they had both carved into their vambrants parts of the Imperial Aquila, so that when they, grabbed each other's hands and, the embrace, the warriors, kind of grasped their vambrants would make the full Aquila, kind of symbolizing their unity and purpose. And despite the DeathGuard's opinion and Gero's own opinion that the Emperor's Children were kind of arrogant peacocks, which was certainly the case of members like Captain or Lord Commander Eidolon and others, he saw in Saul Tarvitz a kindred spirit and someone who also exemplified everything the Imperium should stand for. And so when he saw that Saul was trying to reach the surface, he contacted him and they had a conversation, and Gero had to make a decision in only a few minutes to spare his honor brother or see him as a traitor to their legions. And he basically knew that it was probably improbable that Saul was a traitor and that something deeper was going on, and he ordered his ship to open fire on the fighter craft and cleared the way for Saul Tarvitz to reach the surface of Isstvan III. This action allowed for the Loyalists on Isstvan III to end up holding out for months worth of time against their former comrades, allowing a delay in the plans of Horus and allowing the Loyalists to eventually be alerted and have a bit more time to prepare for the oncoming onslaught from the traitor legions. Due to the misgivings of both Mortarion and other leadership within the Legion, like Typhon, they did have aboard with Gero a loyalist to them, to the traitors, which was Captain Grogor and some of his men. And Grogor was a piece of work in general. Anytime he showed up, he was kind of this thuggish type of individual in personality and in leadership type, I would say. And Gero knew that Grogor was there to keep an eye on him, so to speak, and he didn't really trust Grogor or his men. And he had his own serf watch them, basically to see what they were up to on the ship itself. And shortly after sending his serf to do this, then he was tipped off by Saul Tarvitz aboard the fighter craft, aboard the Thunderhawk, that not all was well. And at the same time that this was going on, the serf reported back to some of Gero's men that Gor's men were arming the ship, and they found out it was virus bombs. And so this eventually brought both forces into conflict with each other to, stop them from firing these horrible weapons down on the surface on their own men. And so a small battle for control over the ship and these weapons ensued, and in the process of the fight, one of the virus bombs gets cracked open and starts seeping out its ultra-deadly liquid into the air, aerosolizing instantly, and anything it comes in contact with is going to basically liquefy into goop on contact, which is what this virus is built to do. Gero's house servant, his serf, was able to seal the room off with Gor's command staff and sacrifice himself along with the men under Gor's command, and they all succumbed to this virus, leaving Gero in charge of the Eisenstein and allowing him to make way to escape the Isstvan system to try to reach Loyalist space and warn Loyalists of the coming betrayal and civil war that was just starting here. At the same time, some last Loyalists from the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship itself, and this consisted of Eacton Cruz, one of the, if not the oldest serving captain of the Sons of Horus, formerly Luna Wolves Legion, as well as 40kLore, Olaton, and Kyril Cinderman. All of these people end up fulfilling very important roles for the Imperium in the long term, and so the Eisenstein, along with Gero, ends up serving this key role for them as well to get them back to Loyalist space and to their destinies as well. And Gero ended up spending some time in discussion with 40kLore, who at this point was becoming the first Imperial Saint, one of the first to start the cult of godhood around the Emperor and true worship of him as a god. And while Gero wasn't 1000% sold on that yet, he had kind of an intrinsic faith in himself for at least loyalty to the Emperor and his mission, if not a divinity. But he could see something important in Euphrates and the rest of them, and he was pretty much aware that it was important to bring them along with him as they escaped. As the Eisenstein fled the Isstvan III system, it came under the gaze of the main flagship of Typhon, the Terminus Est, which was a battleship that completely outclassed the Eisenstein in every way. And Typhon at this point was basically aware that Nathaniel was trying to escape and ordered the Est to intercept and fire upon the Eisenstein. And the Est almost does this. It severely damages the Eisenstein, and Gero is forced to basically do a blind warp jump to escape the wrath of his former brothers and the first captain. Their navigator was killed, and the ship severely damaged to the point that its Geller field was unstable, and the Geller field is what is the barrier that keeps the warp out of the ship itself. And since this was weakened, the remains of Grolgor and his men reanimated and basically became kind of like, not a true former Plague Marine yet, but something reanimated by the warp and assaulted their former brothers once more. And things were not going well for the Loyalists here, and one of Nathaniel Garro's men was infected by Grolgor using a plague knife, and this was apparently Nurgle's rot, which is Nurgle's most potent and ancient and oldest disease that he concocted. And his name is Saul and Garviel, and he ends up getting put into quarantine because of this, basically in like kind of a stasis type pod. Not true stasis, but like basically something to seal off him from the rest of them, since what he has is incredibly contagious in more ways than one, being a warp-borne illness. To stop this onslaught, Gero orders a emergency warp jump back into real space, and this causes the reanimation of Grolgor and his men to dissipate and stop their seemingly unstoppable attack on the rest of the ship. And this shook Gero a bit. None of them had really ever seen warp incursions quite like this before, and it wasn't really known yet that Horus had sided with the forces of chaos. Euphrates and Chiral Cinderman knew a little bit about this at this point, but no one really knew what the Chaos Gods were due to the Imperial truth and censorship by the Emperor and Maclador and the rest of the apparatus of the Emperor. And so, this revelation was just yet another one on top of nothing but bad news so far for Gero and his crew here. And Gero, basically in a fit of desperation and last action, ordered the warp cores of the ship to be jettisoned and detonated in a hope that loyalists and not traitors would see their warp signature and come for them. And whether it was a divine revelation or poking by the Emperor himself to have Gero do this, or just pure coincidence, this prayer, so to speak, was answered by none other than Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists Legion, aboard the Phalanx itself. By this point, Nathaniel and his forces had been stranded here for a little while, and they were running low on supplies, and then Dorn and a contingent of his men teleported aboard the Eisenstein, and were able to bring Gero and some of his people aboard the Phalanx. Well, they brought everyone aboard because the Eisenstein was basically junk at this point. There was no saving it at this point. Now, Gero had the challenging and somewhat deadly job to break the news to Rogal Dorn that a brother he looked up to greatly was the mastermind behind betraying the Emperor and the entire premise of the Great Crusade. And at first, Dorn was not having it. He refused testimony by Gero at first, and by crews and other Space Marines with them. He didn't want to believe anything 40kLore said, or Chiral Cinderman, none of them. To the point where, at one point, he openly strikes Gero and sends him flying across the room that they're in, skidding across basically the marble floors of the Phalanx. And just kind of a fun note here, this is one of those times where we get to see just how much more powerful a Primarch is physically than a Space Marine. It is narrated here that Gero saw zero movement before being struck and sent flying across the room by Dorn. It just emphasizes that Dorn was so fast that it seemed impossible to them. But with them is Olaton, and Olaton is a type of remembrancer who she has built into her head a video recorder, essentially, and she was able to record footage of the moment that Horus opened fire on Isstvan III and wiped out the Loyalist elements of their legions, which happened shortly before she and the rest of them were able to escape the Vengeful Spirit and get to Gero on the Eisenstein. With this revelation delivered to Dorn, Dorn spent some time in kind of a fit of rage until he recovered his senses and made all haste for Terra. The Phalanx arrived in the outer reaches of the Sol system and basically sped about as fast as it could to Terra, going like 2/4 light speed, something really fast for something this size. And there was some fanfare and stuff prepared for them to show up and kind of make their merry way to Terra, but Dorn blew past all of it in kind of an emergency run to get to Terra and warn the leadership there of the coming conflict. Gero and his forces were remanded to Luna, to the moon, and kind of into the care/jailing of the Sisters of Silence, which were based out there. And basically they were awaiting their fate. Gero thought it was possible that they would get executed for, being part of a traitor legion now. Their fates were not known. Dorn himself didn't know what their fates would ultimately be. He wasn't going to pass judgment on them, but he said, basically, you can't be fully trusted because of where you come from, despite you telling us of what's coming. And Dorn, at this point especially, the very thought of there being traitors at all was still new to him. And so he definitely ended up with a lot of trust issues just from this. But to his credit, he didn't take rash action against Gero or his men, and allowed that fate to be determined by Maclador the Sigilite and the Emperor. And while Gero was awaiting his fate on Luna, this is when Nurgle reached out once more to try once again to basically exact vengeance at this point. Instead of stopping them from telling the Emperor, Gero was to be destroyed, probably in anger by Nurgle at this point. And so his former friend Solon Decius was still in stasis at this point, and Solon had been fighting Nurgle's rot for a while and eventually relinquished control and ended up being possessed by a greater demon of Nurgle known as the Lord of Flies. And he broke out of containment, and Gero ended up hunting him down, and they fought and were eventually even broken out into real space, out into the vacuum of the surface of Luna itself, with Terra looming overhead. And this is where Gero was able to finally slay this former friend of his that Nurgle had taken, along with everything else that Gero had ever known and cared for, other than the Emperor himself. Shortly after this is when Gero is approached by Maclador the Sigilite in person, and he's brought into a room along with the Oblivion Knight from the Sisters of Silence, Amandera Kendall, who had kind of a previous somewhat run-in with Gero. Gero had assisted her with taking out some Xenopsychers in the later stages of the Great Crusade. And then along with Maclador in this room and the Sister of Silence was also a member of the Adeptus Custodes, chief bodyguards of the Emperor himself. At first, Gero thought that Maclador simply wanted to interview Gero before executing him to kind of keep the traitor stuff a secret still. But Maclador surprised Gero with a mission, actually. Maclador wanted Gero to serve him instead and become his first Knight Errant, which was basically a secret force of Space Marines chosen from across Loyalists and traitors to do the will of the Sigilite himself in preparation for future plans to create things like the Grey Knights, the Inquisition, and other organizations that would go on to fulfill very important roles within the Imperium and to prolong its survival past the Horus Heresy. And in this way, Gero becomes one of the chief keystones and foundations of the future Imperium survival, long past what anyone would have expected 10,000 plus years later. And little does the Imperium know by that point that they owe some of their foundational success to a member of a traitor legion, the man who basically had to forsake his entire brotherhood to warn the Emperor and the rest of the Imperium of what was coming, and receive basically no accolades for such an action. But Gero is a man that didn't need any external validation like that, and he served Maclador and the Imperium in the position of Chief of the Knights Errant for the next close to 7 years past the initial start of the Horus Heresy. And Gero was tasked at first with finding 7 individuals to bring into the Knights Errant. One of these ended up being Garviel Loken, who he retrieved from the smoldering ruins of Isstvan III, not too long after the demise of the Loyalists there, amongst several others from across the legions. And he helped build this up and do many other secretive and unknown operations for the Sigilite himself. One of the last great actions that Gero takes along with the Knights Errant is during the Siege of Terra itself, during the Saturnine Gambit, which basically was a time where Abaddon, first captain of the Sons of Horus, saw a weakness in one of the siege walls of the palace, and then this was brought to the attention of Dorn that they were going to assault this weakness, this perceived weak point, and so poised for attacking this incursion was the Knights Errant, which was Gero, Garviel Loken, and many other members of this force, along with members of Rogal Dorn's Legion, the Imperial Fists. And they very nearly succeeded in killing Ezekiel Abaddon himself, and they successfully wiped out large portions of the Sons of Horus Elite First Company and several other elite companies within that legion. And then after the Knights Errant that were psychic latent were chosen to be Grey Knights, Gero, who was not a psychic, along with Loken and a few others, were basically released from Maclador's command and given leave to basically fight amongst the palace defenses as they saw fit at that point. And for a time, Gero led some kill squads and things like that, helping to shore up defenses where they were weaker and ambush enemy troops, things of that nature. Eventually, in a gambit to save Keeler and some others who were in the direct path of his former father, Mortarion, Gero confronted his former Primarch, who is now a monstrous demon prince of the plague god, Nurgle. And Mortarion, once again, did not outright want to slay Gero. He offered Gero a place at his side. He still seemingly had some kind of soft spot for Gero. He just knew that Gero was a great warrior and great soul, and that it would be great to have him by his side, despite, everything that transpired over the last 7 years at this point. Gero steadfastly refused this invitation, and then they ended up in conflict. And it wasn't much of a fight, considering Primarchs alone are way more powerful than individual Space Marines, and let alone one that is further augmented by otherworldly powers coming from the warp itself. Gero was overcome by a gigantic swarm of flies, with Mortarion threatening to basically forcefully inhabit his body with these flies in kind of like a way to punish him for his defiance. But then Keeler was able to infuse Gero with a last bit of faith in the Emperor, which seemed to purify and keep him safe from such a fate, and allowed Gero one last act of defiance in fighting against his gene father. This doesn't last very long, and eventually Gero is impaled upon Mortarion's great scythe, Silence, and his sword is broken. And in one very last act of defiance, Gero is able to stab the jagged edge of his broken sword into Mortarion's neck, giving him a last sting, a last spit in the eye, so to speak, from the last loyal son of his legion, essentially. Or at least the last one to confront Mortarion directly. And while it's not said anywhere, I wonder if this last bit of defiance, possibly directed by the Emperor, or what passes as the God Emperor and faith by Euphrates Keeler, is what enables Chakate Khan, Primarch of the White Scars, to confront and defeat Mortarion shortly after this happens. And that is the conclusion to Nathaniel Garro's story. It is said that his name is possibly within the halls of martyrs for the Imperial Church once it was founded by Euphrates and Kyril Sinderman, but who knows if that is exactly true. That seems to be kind of a rumor. But if so, Gero would have the rare honor of having his name somewhere in the Imperial records officially, and didn't, lose his name to the conflict like Captain Tarvitz did and Garviel Loken, whose names and deeds remain unknown to the Imperium at large 10,000 years later. And that is really it for Nathaniel Garro. A pretty great story with him. He is certainly up there for one of the best characters overall within the Horus Heresy series. And I think at the time that I first, read about him all the way back in those early books, nearly 20 years ago, I would never have thought he would, continue this far into the future, just like I didn't think that with Garviel Loken either. And it's been pretty interesting to read about the same character from the beginning to the end of his story, just about 20 years later, and it's pretty great to be able to follow these characters, even if their story is ultimately tragic, like so many of them are within the Warhammer universe itself. But that's part of why I like it. In this universe, it's, in a sense, delightfully bleak in that way, but with the tinges of honor and sacrifice and, defiance against that dark night to the very last drop of your own constitution, of your own integrity. And Gero exemplified that sort of struggle, and that struggle against the darkness consuming his men, his legion, his father, and he was granted that final honor at the end, which is a much more resolved end than many heroes were able to gain throughout the heresy. Many were kind of suffering very ignoble deaths and very tragic deaths that had no real purpose, and I feel like Gero's served some purpose at the end, and his existence certainly helped to found and create many elements that have kept the Imperium alive, at the very least, into the far future. As always, if you liked this video, please leave a like or subscribe. It will serve to help this channel grow, and I appreciate your time here either way. If you choose not to like or subscribe, I still appreciate your time here. Very much respect you, and thank you. And if you do subscribe, then there's a new video that comes out every week. Sometimes I get 2 out in a week, but right now we're at a pace of 1 a week at the moment. And as always, I hope you have a great day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next video. Look forward to reading your comments and discussing with you if you'd like. See you next time.